Okay, so in this episode, we're going to talk about one small exploratory study that we did to look at what people thought of humility and openness and how they actually relate to each other as variables, if you like. So we did an empirical study using questionnaires with some closed questions and some open-ended responses sought from people. We sampled 431 participants from 3 countries, from England, from India, and from Spain. And we used we tapped into academic groups. So we used students and academic staff. So what was the purpose of this study? One purpose was to establish possible similarities, possible overlaps between how people perceive humility and how they perceive openness. Second, to explore in people's descriptions of humility what they saw of the emotional, the relational, and the everyday aspects of this phenomenon. Third, to establish possible relationships between emotional openness, intellectual humility, openness to experience, and hope or hopefulness. And fourth, to explore cultural variations. Now, we wanted to look at habits of openness and habits of social contact and how, if you like, they might make a difference in the way people think about humility and think about openness. So we chose these 3 countries for a reason. So we chose England, India, and Spain for a reason. So on the one hand, Spain and India are reported to have greater emphasis on an interdependent, more sociable, more socially connected style of living, kind of more family-oriented kind of style, in contrast to the UK, where this might be a bit less. Another reason is that both Spain and the UK have a common European kind of culture at some level, in contrast to India. So these 3 things are starting to pan out with pairing up with one another in different ways on different dimensions. And the third reason is you could argue that both in the UK and in India, there is a common emphasis on hierarchy, which is obviously relevant to humility in some ways, as different from Spain, where this is apparently very much less the case. So these 3 countries seemed to capture some degrees of commonality in different ways with each other and some degrees of difference. And we were kind of interested, as an exploratory study, does this make a difference? How does it fall out? So the first question, you remember, was, do humility and openness relate to each other? So we had a humility and openness scale. And in relation to both of these factors, we didn't ask people, do you show traits of humility? Do you show or like being open, right? Because we figured that people answering questions about their own apparent humility or apparent openness has kind of got too many contradictions in it. You can't be humble and say, I am humble. You could be open, but you may not know it. And it kind of is an uncomfortable way of getting at how do these 2 factors relate to each other. So what we did was we constructed a questionnaire where we asked people about people whom they like. So the starter question was, I like people who, and then we had all these different options, and you had to grade them in terms of how much you like people who show these qualities. So for the humility qualities, there were some questions which didn't relate to each other so well. It's called a composite reliability of 5 questions was really quite high. Okay, so these 5 questions, which seem to kind of capture and relate to each other as a package, were as follows. I like people who have the ability to acknowledge their mistakes and limitations. This is a kind of standard humility and intellectual humility factor. I like people who have an appreciation of value in all things. I like people who have no understanding of their own imperfections. There was a kind of a mixture of the positive and the negative phrasing of these questions. I like people who have an accurate opinion of themselves. I like people who like to feel superior to others. Okay, so these kind of formed one fairly tight package. And the composite reliability was 0.69, which is pretty high. Now, the openness questions within the same questionnaire were the ones which had this high reliability were as follows. I like people who feel others' emotions easily. I like people who have an open and receptive mind. I like people who are not afraid of negative emotions because they're a part of everyday life. I like people who enjoy experiencing the new. And I like people who see beauty where others may not. And these questions hung together in people's responses with an even higher composite reliability of 0.76. The highest you can get, by the way, is 1. So if you're getting above the 0.6s, you're getting into very, very high reliable territory. So the key findings from these studies were that openness and humility correlate actually reasonably well, which I'll tell you about in a second. That there were no dramatic differences between the countries in the way in which they described either intellectual humility or emotional openness. And third key finding was that hope, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which we also measured with little scales, are well predicted by openness and humility, but they are not. But openness to experience is not predicted by these two, which is interesting because openness to experience seems to be not about personal relations, and it seems to sit slightly differently from this kind of interpersonal openness or humility. So what we found was in the entire sample, the correlation between these humility items and these openness items was 0.8, which is really high. So the strongest relationship in India was a correlation of 0.82 between them. In Spain of 0.74, which is less, and in England of 0.69. And this kind of fit really neatly with our prediction of the more sociable, if you like, a culture seems to encourage its participants, its members to be. Perhaps it is the case that the more they will see these two things as being one and the same, or very close to each other. Maybe these two concepts blur and merge into each other more if your lifestyle is kind of very much more interdependent and social. We also, in this questionnaire, had open-ended questions about intellectual humility and about emotional openness. And people's responses were really rather nice. I mean, there were many, many everyday examples described, which were situation-specific in calling up what is humility. And certainly there were also some trait descriptions as well. Are you referring to people as he is definitely arrogant, or he is a humble sort of person, etc.? But nearly 100% of them, of the descriptions that people offered of humility, were social descriptions of situations, and approximately 50% of these included emotional openness to the other. So there was, both in terms of the way in which they responded to the quantitative questionnaire and in terms of the way in which they gave examples, give me examples of humility or openness, there was a huge degree of overlap between them. Okay, let me give you a few examples of what people talked about to show this kind of overlapping characteristic of humility and openness. So here's a question that we asked people and we got them to write. Describe a situation where someone you know, not you, remember, it was always asking about other people, where someone you know showed intellectual humility. Okay, so here are some examples. A guest lecturer came to give a seminar on educational psychology, and this person has a PhD and many years of experience and has written many articles and books. During the seminar, she gave ultimate respect to everyone who asked questions and gave suggestions. She was open to queries during and after the seminar. She did not make us feel incapable, even though we were completely inexperienced in the field. Another one. A friend of mine heard me with utmost patience, even while in the middle of work. She gave me a sense of trust and of being cared for. So just look at the kinds of qualities that are coming up. Here's another one. My dad helped me through a tough time. He spoke to me empathetically and took the time to understand what was going on. And another one. I recently attended a seminar on leadership, and the guest speaker was so intellectually refined, such an awesome and enlightened speaker who touched every member present in the room with his speech. Okay, so there's something going on about reaching out and connecting. He was so humble, so friendly that it created a great imprint on my mind. Okay, so there's again trust, caring, touching, friendliness, helping. Not things that you would see as necessary features of intellectual humility, but that's how they were coming up. So when we asked them in summary, when we collated descriptions of what is a humble person, sober, patient, grounded, humble, good listeners, non-judgmental. These were kind of terms that came up. They're calm, concerned, and reachable. They're genuine, honest, trustworthy. They're kind, respectful, clever, helpful, down to earth. Okay, so it's quite a wide variety of terms here, and not all of them are about thought. Many of them are about relating to other people, and a lot of them are about emotional attitudes of being in relation with others.